Imagine a moment. A person who appears on the stage of history completely out of nowhere. No lineage, no childhood story, no introduction. Just a single sentence, and an entire nation holds its breath. This is Elijah, whose life does not begin with noise, but with silence. And from that silence erupts a fire that shakes the thrones of kings. The Bible does not tell us which city Elijah was born in, what his father's name was, or what he learned in childhood, because sometimes God keeps his power free from human background. When Elijah is mentioned for the first time, he is standing directly before the king of Israel, as if he had descended from the heavens. At that time, Israel was suffering from deep spiritual decline. The people were trapped between God and idols, and the most powerful influence among them was the corrupt worship known by the name of Baal. At the center of this decline stood King Ahab, politically powerful, yet spiritually weak. And casting a dark shadow over his life was his wife Jezebel, a woman who was not merely a queen, but the very ideology of idolatry itself. In this atmosphere, Elijah's first sentence echoes, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain in the coming years, except at my word." This was not a prayer, not a plea. It was a declaration. And from this point, Elijah's true nature is revealed. A man who stands so directly before God that his tongue becomes the channel of God's judgment. The rain stops. The land dries up. Crops are destroyed. And for the first time, the nation realizes that the effects of spiritual slavery do not remain confined to temples. They reach the stomach and the water supply as well. Yet what is astonishing is that after this declaration, Elijah does not stay in the city like a hero. God quietly sends him to a valley where there is no crowd and no applause. There, God teaches him that the prophet who speaks for a nation must first be broken in solitude. In that valley, where a small stream flows, Elijah witnesses a strange miracle every day. Ravens bring him bread and meat. This is not merely provision, it is a spiritual lesson that God can sustain his servant through means that humans consider unclean or unworthy. When even the water of the valley dries up, it is not failure, but preparation for the next level. God sends Elijah to the house of a poor widow, where only a handful of flour and a little oil remain. Here, Elijah's test is not just to perform a miracle, but to understand human emotion. The woman is preparing her last meal for herself and her son, and Elijah asks her to make bread for him first. This sounds harsh, but here God's system is revealed. When faith moves ahead of reason, scarcity turns into blessing. The flour does not run out, the oil does not dry up, and the house becomes a center of provision. Then, an even deeper moment arrives when the widow's son dies. Here, Elijah appears not only as a prophet, but as a man who feels pain. He questions God, cries out, and then lies upon the child, praying for life. When the child breathes again, it is not merely a miracle of resurrection. It is proof that God holds authority over both life and death. So now the scene changes. After 3 years of drought, there is a strange stillness in the air, as if nature itself is holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. The ground is cracked, faces are weary, and the people have come to understand that this was not merely a problem of weather. This was a spiritual judgment. At this moment, God tells Elijah to return and confront the king. And this return is not a hero's comeback. It is like inviting death, because Jezebel is still alive, and her hatred has only intensified with time. When King Ahab and Elijah come face to face, the king accuses him. "You are the one who has destroyed Israel. Elijah replies without fear, "I have not brought destruction. Your disobedience has." From here, a confrontation is set that is not merely between two individuals, but between two powers, the living God and false gods. The location is chosen, Mount Carmel, where a decision between heaven and earth was to be written. Elijah stands alone, and opposite him is a system of idolatry nurtured for centuries, hundreds of prophets, noise, dancing, self-inflicted wounds, screams, yet the heavens remain completely silent. After hours of shouting, no answer comes, and that silence itself becomes the greatest proof. Then Elijah steps forward. No shouting, no chaos, only this: "If the Lord truly is God, let him answer." He drenches the sacrifice with water, so much so that, by human calculation, the possibility of fire is eliminated. And then a short prayer, and fire falls from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the stones, the water, everything. In that moment, the nation cries out, "The Lord, He is God." This is not just a miracle, it is a moment of spiritual awakening. But the story does not end here, because even after spiritual victory, the human body grows weary. Elijah prays, and the same sky that had been closed for 3 years slowly begins to open. A small cloud rises from the sea, and then the rain pours down. The land comes back to life, but an unusual heaviness settles in Elijah's heart. When Jezebel sends a message saying, "By this time tomorrow you will not be alive," the same prophet who witnessed fire falling from heaven runs away. This is one of the most human moments in the Bible, where a witness of divine power trembles in fear. Sitting in the wilderness, he says, "Enough is enough. Take my life." God does not rebuke him. First, he lets him sleep. Then he feeds him, because sometimes physical exhaustion comes before spiritual weakness. Elijah then journeys to the mountain where Moses once stood, Mount Horeb, Sinai. There, a storm comes, an earthquake, and fire. But God is not in them. Finally, there is a gentle whisper, and here Elijah understands that God does not always speak through fire. Sometimes he heals wounds through silence. There, Elijah is also told that he is not alone. God's work is still moving forward. And to carry this mission ahead, a new name is given: Elisha. When Elijah places his cloak upon Elisha, it is not merely a sign of mentorship. It is a declaration that in God's work, the continuation of the mission is more important than the individual. Now the story reaches its final and most mysterious turning point. Elijah is no longer the prophet who appeared suddenly on the stage. He is now a man who knows that his time is about to be fulfilled. This knowledge is not his alone. It is shared with Elisha. And strangely, both are living this truth in silence rather than words. As Elijah begins to walk, in every town, at every place, the prophet's disciple asks him, "Do you know that today your master will be taken from you?" Elisha only replies, "Yes, I know. Be silent." This silence is not ignorance, but deep understanding, because some moments can only be spoken through the Spirit. Elijah repeatedly tells Elisha to stay here while he goes ahead, but Elisha's answer is always the same: "By the life of God, I will not leave you." This loyalty is not only to the master, but to the call that Elisha knows is about to come upon his own shoulders. Finally, they reach the banks of the Jordan River, a river that signifies crossing and transformation. Elijah takes his cloak, strikes the water, and it splits into two. This seems like the shadow of Moses, but in reality, it is a message. God's work is never limited to one person, but the chain of his power continues. After crossing the river, Elijah asks Elisha one last time, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I go?" This question echoes for centuries because Elisha's answer is not a request for power, but a demand for responsibility. Give me a double portion of your spirit. This double portion is not double power, but the portion of a firstborn, an acceptance of the responsibility to carry the mission forward. Elijah says it is a difficult thing, but if Elisha sees him taken away, it will be granted. Then comes the moment that shakes not only the Bible, but human imagination itself. Chariots of fire and horses of fire appear from heaven, and Elijah is taken up into the sky without tasting death. This is not just an exit, but a testimony that a life burning for God does not end on earth. Elisha cries out, "My father, my father!" Because in truth, he is not losing his master, but his spiritual father. When silence returns, only Elijah's cloak lies on the ground. And here the real test begins. Elisha returns to the banks of the Jordan, and for the first time he lifts the cloak, which has now become not just a symbol, but a responsibility. He strikes the water and asks, "Where is the God of Elijah?" When the water splits again, it is proof that God did not go with Elijah. He is here, present, to continue his work. Elijah's story seems to end here, but in reality, this is where his legacy begins. Because stepping out of the pages of the Bible, he becomes a sign for every person who has ever stood alone, who has ever fled in fear, and yet rises again at God's call. Elijah teaches us that God makes extraordinary people through ordinary paths, that both fire and silence are in his hand, and that a life lived with complete faithfulness to God does not end confined to the earth. This story is not just of a prophet. It is the story of every heart that asks, "Can one person really make a difference?" And Elijah's life answers with full force, "Yes, if that person belongs entirely to God." Now, if we consider Elijah's life merely as a story or history, we miss the real treasure, because his miracles were not just displays of power, they were training sessions in which God taught humans to trust him while remaining human. Elijah's first miracle was the stopping of the rain. And the very first lesson here is that God's greatest judgment often comes not through voice, but through obedience. Elijah did not pray long, nor perform rituals. He simply spoke what God had commanded. From this, we learn that spiritual authority comes not from noise, but from alignment. When a person stands straight with God, nature itself speaks through their words. Then, when Elijah is sent to the valley and the ravens bring him food, this miracle teaches us that God sometimes sustains us through unexpected sources. The raven, which normally knows how to take, not give, becomes the source of provision. The lesson here is that when resources in life seem wrong or inadequate, that may actually be God's plan. The deeper message of this miracle is that faith does not mean understanding everything. It means that as long as we can hear God's steps, the path is sufficient. Then the stream in the valley dries up. And here we learn that not every miracle provides permanent comfort. Sometimes God ends a miracle so that the servant can move to the next stage. If Elijah had clung to the valley, he would never have witnessed the miracle in the widow's house. When Elijah tells a poor widow to make bread for him first, this miracle teaches us that God's system runs not on scarcity, but on priority. The miracle was not just the increase of flour and oil, but a test of who comes first, fear or faith. When the woman chose against her own reasoning, scarcity turned into blessing. Then, when her son dies, and Elijah sees him brought back to life through prayer, this miracle teaches us that God is not only the provider of sustenance, but also the restorer of life. Yet this miracle has another deep aspect. Elijah debates with God for the first time, questions him, cries out. Here we learn that true faith sometimes asks questions, and God is not threatened by them. Then comes the fire on Mount Carmel. This miracle was not just a fire show. It was a declaration that God does not accept compromise. Elijah drenched the sacrifice with water to make it clear that if anything happens, it will happen solely because of God. From this, we learn that when we remove backup plans from our lives, God's power is fully revealed. The descent of fire teaches that truth is never dependent on the majority. One person and one God are enough. Then the rain comes, a small cloud that becomes a full storm. This miracle teaches us that God often works through small beginnings. Those who wait only for big signs miss the small hope. Elijah recognized the small sign and prayed repeatedly until the answer was complete. From this we learn that persistence is also part of faith. Then the most astonishing miracle, when Elijah is taken alive by the chariots of fire. The lesson here is that life burning for God does not end in the ordinary. It frees us from the fear of death and shows that obedience is never wasted. And finally, the falling of the cloak, which may not seem like a flashy miracle, but is actually the most important sign. From this, we learn that the focus of God's work is never a single hero. It transfers responsibility, spirit, mission. Elijah's miracles teach us that God wants to make people more than just show miracles. That fire, water, bread, rain, all are in His hands. And that if a person chooses to stand before God despite weakness, their life itself becomes a living testimony. Elijah's story does not end here, because in every era, God searches for ordinary people who can say, "I am ready." And then God turns that readiness into power.